Hi everyone, and welcome to the Storied Life, a series of 10 short videos on what it means to pay closer attention to the life we are already living. I'm Bob Osborne, and I will be your guide in this series. We think we know our stories, but do we? Most of us have never taken the time really to reflect on what I'm calling our storied life or our storied experience. Maybe because we don't think we have lived a very interesting life, or maybe because we can't imagine there is anything to learn from our own stories, or maybe simply because no one has ever suggested we do this. But I am suggesting we do this. I am inviting you to take a look at your own storied life. In this series, I want to outline some key aspects of story and apply those insights to the life you have already lived and are living. We're going to use biblical stories as our foundation and reference point, but what we're looking for is simply how story itself works, what story does for us, and indeed how story will help us orient ourselves towards more hopefulness. So a bit about me as we begin. I am a lifelong pastor and teacher. I have taught the Bible for many years in churches and classrooms. Over these past few years, I've become a spiritual director as well, which means I listen to people's stories. I help them pay attention to what is going on inside them and help them find God in the details. This idea, I think, of paying closer attention has grown more important to me because I realize I've missed a lot in life when I wasn't paying attention. Now, I am a reader. I love to read. But there are those times when I'm reading something and I suddenly realize I've been lost in thought about something else, you too. So I have to retreat a couple of pages and I have to pick up where I was last connected. I think in the same way, it's possible to miss the meaning of the very life we are living, the meaning and the wonder and the significance of our lives. We can all too easily get distracted by not paying attention. So here's what I hope, that if we listen more closely to story itself, to the biblical stories, also to biography and perhaps to literary fiction, we just might learn aspects of our own storied life. And I should also say here that I am a man of Christian faith, which I've already said, and I'm going to speak to people of faith. But if you categorize yourself differently, as unsure or as merely curious, I wonder if we can find some common ground under the rubric of story. Maybe this is a way we can learn to talk about the unfolding mystery of human experience. So let's begin. So let's talk more about the idea of story and why it matters to the well-lived life. In his Massey lectures, The Triumph of Narrative, Robert Fulford shares an image I have always loved. He says, a woman turns a corner, meets a strange man. 2 years later, they marry, they have children together. And in 20 years, there are adults walking the earth who would not have existed if that woman had not turned that corner on that day. Fulford is speaking of the mystery of how our lives unfold, isn't he? Through such seemingly small moments. And some of you might be wondering where that corner is. But what we have here is the bones of a story, complete with character and plot and outcome. And because it's a happy story, we want to know more. We want to fill in details. We want to find out what follows. As Fulford relates here, to tell about a moment like this is really to revel in the wondrous details that matter. And they matter because they explain life. They help us make connections. They show us how things came to be. They have meaning and they show direction. Because this happened, there are many other things that have happened, including the existence of actual people on the earth. So we understand our very being through story. Maybe I could say it this way. looking back on all the things that happen to us in our life. Often it is the small, unplanned moments that come to loom large. Life is this mystery that unfolds. Perhaps this woman turned that corner on numerous occasions, maybe every day, maybe for years, none of which she especially remembered, except for that moment. Perhaps all those moments going around that corner for her before that time was mindless and trivial and insignificant. But then suddenly, in the unfolding of her life, one day that corner becomes something more, doesn't it? A moment in her life which explains all that follows. And she never forgets it. And she tells it. She tells her children and her grandchildren about the time she first met the love of her life, her husband, their father and grandfather, as if by accident. And she says to her grandkids sitting on her knee, and maybe you wouldn't even be here if that hadn't have happened. So story invites us into the profound mystery of life. Story invites us to reflect on the connections that come from the details. Story invites us to consider the way it could have been different, but for some reason isn't. Story invites us to consider the graces that have come our way, the losses we have incurred and still grieve, but also the hopes we still carry in our hearts for ultimate resolution and for peace. We live this storied life. And I believe that's why all of this is so important to us, because we somehow intuit in the depths of our being that life is meant to have both a meaning and a direction. You know, there are people who try to create meaningless stories. There are some authors and some movie makers who try to tell us that life is simply random and chaotic. That's all it is. I used to try to do that at the dinner table when my daughters were young. I would say, you know what happened to me today? And I'd proceed to tell this random story of happenings that I was driving along, and then I stopped at a red light, and then the light turned green, and then I went again. And then I kept driving until I got to my destination, and then I opened the door, and I got out, and I walked to the building, and I opened that door. On and on the details go, filling in all these pieces, but not really saying anything, not getting anywhere. And I remember one of my daughters would say, "Dad, what's the point of your story? A story has to have a point." Yes, it does. Otherwise, why tell it? But in the case with my daughters and that silly little story, I meant to make it meaningless. There's the irony. Because even those who try to write meaningless stories mean to do that. They're attempting to make a point, aren't they, about life? And there's the inescapable, well, we can't seem to get out of meaning. Meaning seems to be built into things. So let's ask the more serious question then. How do we already know that what we're participating in is inherently meaningful? And if it is, if life has meaning, what can we then do to pay more attention to what is going on? I'd like to create a vocabulary for us for what we're doing here in these videos. I want to call this idea that life is without a point or a direction as despair. A dictionary definition of despair would be the complete loss or absence of hope. On the other hand, I want to call life's inherent meaningfulness as the condition of faith, which the dictionary would define as complete trust or confidence in someone or something. I think this way of naming things is really what we're trying to do in this series of videos. We're trying to discern meaningful direction in our up-close and personal lives. You know, the faith condition is the ability to take in all the details, all the happenings of our lives. And I mean all. I mean the good, the blessed, and also the sorrowful and sad. And to be able to see that somehow life is moving towards a meaningful and good conclusion. That's the faith perspective. Despair is the condition that fails to see any meaning at all, giving up on the idea that life is going anywhere. And as you can see, this is serious business. One of my favorite pieces of literature is found in G.K. Chesterton's masterful book, Orthodoxy, in which he writes a chapter called The Ethics of Elfland. Chesterton was a powerhouse of English wit and wisdom in the early part of the 20th century. If you look on the internet, you're going to find this resource free because it is an old book past copyright, Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton makes the case that it was through story itself that he came to faith. At first, it wasn't the story of faith. It wasn't the story of God or Jesus or the Bible that captured his heart or his imagination. That came later. What first moved him towards faith in God was the concept of story itself, especially those stories read to him in his childhood. Chesterton said that his earliest memories were the wonder in these stories, the surprise, the beauty, the order, the meaning. And as we know, every child loves being read to, even if they already know the story and they know where it's going. And maybe especially then. Because for a child, story somehow orders the world. It shows them how the world works. It reminds them of the basic categories, shows them goodness and courage and beauty and hope. And I don't think children philosophize their way to these ideas. They just get them. There's something found in story that teaches us about life itself. So Chesterton argues from the magic of story to the logic of faith. That's how he comes about it. He says this, in short, I had always believed that the world involved magic, and now I thought that perhaps it involved a magician. And this pointed a profound emotion always present in subconscious, that this world of ours has some purpose, and if there is a purpose, there is a person. I had always felt life first as a story, and if there is a story, there is a storyteller. Life is experienced as a story, says Chesterton. And if there is a story, there's a storyteller. And all of this Chesterton said he came to believe as true about life, even before he ever thought about God or the Christian faith. So let me say it again. Wherever we are in the journey of faith, whatever we think about God, I hope we can agree that there is a wonder in the world, a wonder we somehow feel deep inside of ourselves. Can we learn to pay more attention to the pieces of our lives that are right at hand? I think we can if we're willing. Socrates famously said that the unexamined life is not worth living, and that seems right to me. There is too much wonder in us and around us to be left untouched and unnoticed, like an unread book. So here's how we've structured these videos and what you can expect as you follow along. This is what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about beginnings and endings, how story needs to start us at some chosen point, but it does so in order for us to track the movement towards destination. We're going to talk about living with conditions. All stories are set within defining realities that must be understood, and we usually call this the setting, but I want us to consider that it means more than the scenery. We want to talk about clues to a kind world. If a story is truthful, it will not only be about happiness, there will be some sadness too, or even evil, but in all true and meaningful stories, we will find enough clues to hold on to ultimate goodness. We're going to talk about the power of words. We are powerfully shaped by the words around us, by the words that are spoken to us and the words we speak ourselves. Words matter. We're going to talk about getting the story unstuck. We all know what it means for a story to bog down for one reason or another, to become frustrated maybe. So how does a hopeful story get back on track? We'll talk about memory. There are just certain details in stories one has to hold in mind if we want to understand. Forgetfulness will get you lost. We're going to talk about forms and patterns. As we grow more acquainted with stories, we begin to see that stories carry shapes that remind us of other stories we know. We'll talk about deep order, how stories will periodically descend into confusion and chaos, where disorder seems for a while to be winning, and this is when we need to pay attention to deep order. We'll talk about character in crisis. At heart, stories about showing or revealing who persons are, and character is often revealed in crisis. And finally, we'll talk about home. The nature of story is that it longs for resolution of some kind, a coming to rest or peace, or an achievement of happiness. I am calling this home. You know, one principle of storytelling is that it needs to be selective in what it tells. Not everything can or should be said. To tell a good story requires that we choose what explains or reveals. Like that moment, the woman turned the corner and met the love of her life. We tell our stories by being selective. So here is a good exercise to begin. Select 5, 6, 7 scenes from your life in order to tell your story. Just that many. And as you do, ask yourself these things. What jumped out as important in my story right away? What are the few things that I considered so important? And why these particular moments? What story do they tell about me? And is there any direction or pattern in what I have selected to tell my story? You know, at the very least, this exercise will get you to consider your own story as worthy of attention. Maybe you'll uncover some defining life experiences that just represent who you are. Maybe there'll be a joy or a discovery. Maybe there'll be a wound or a hurt or a decision. Things will become clear to you. And maybe some aspects of your story will cause you to wonder. And you know by now that I love that word wonder, because it suggests that there are depths to our stories that we can't quite explain. One of the key insights you might begin to see is that some of the most important moments of your life happened when you least expected them. One last thing. As a person of faith, I carry confidence in the meanings of human storied life. As I said at the beginning, many of you who view these videos will also be people of faith, but not all of you will be. Some of you struggle with pieces of the Christian view, the Christian story, for whatever reason. So here is my invitation to you. Maybe we can put certain pieces aside for a while and simply consider our own life experience and what it might suggest about the meaning of our lives. I'm going to work from the biblical stories in future episodes because that's the repository of our basic stories. But I'm not asking you to embrace Christian faith. Do what Chesterton did, though. He let story itself teach him the mystery of the world. I hope we can agree on that. I'll see you next time when we talk about beginnings and endings, but bye for now.